God may be speaking to your life in various ways, in various situations. God may have thrown all kinds of messages in your life, different ways to get your attention. Where are you? If you're in the fish today, it's time to pray. a book that is written in context to address some things in Israel. After, as we've noticed in the Old Testament in our journey through the Old Testament on Sunday mornings, after the kingdom divided and Israel and Judah were separated into two separate kingdoms, Jonah is one that addresses Israel in the time of the reign of a king named Jeroboam II. And so that would be in the late 700s before Christ. Now, Jonah, the book of Jonah, is not the only place that Jonah is mentioned. You can look at a reference in 2 Kings, for example, in the 14th chapter, verse 25, where it refers to a prophecy of Jonah regarding some territory that Israel is going to reclaim and repossess. And so Jonah is mentioned there in the book of the Kings as a prophet who prophesied regarding Israel. But the book of Jonah is a little different than that. Some of the prophetic books that we're walking through as we make our way toward the end of the Old Testament contain large portions of prophecies where the Lord speaks a message, speaks a word through the prophet to Judah, to Israel, to other nations, to us. And you'll see those. There's a mixture of the biographical, the context, plus those prophetic words that God gives. Jonah's different than that. Jonah, the story is the message. And perhaps that's why many of us have learned about Jonah from a very young age, because Jonah tells a story. It tells the story of Jonah. It tells the story of God. It tells the story of a city called Nineveh. And the story is the message. And as you read through the story of Jonah, you're able to glean some great truths from God. And I want to hone in on some of those in the first half of Jonah. And I'd like for us to begin, take a look in the opening part of Jonah, the first chapter, and I'd like to walk through those first 3 verses. Let's begin with verses 1 and 2. It says this: "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up, go to that great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because their wickedness has confronted me." However, Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. I'm going to pause right there for a moment and ask a question. Just throw this out there. You don't have to answer out loud, but is verse 1 difficult to understand? There are those times in our lives where God leads us, directs us, gives us instruction, and maybe we say, I just don't understand. Is verse 1 hard to understand? No, not really. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up, go to Nineveh, and preach against it, because their wickedness has risen up before me. God gives a directive to Jonah, not difficult to understand. Jonah's response to that comes in the words that follow. However, Jonah got up to flee. Now let's go on and read the next verse. "He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare and went down into it to go with him to Tarshish from the Lord's presence." We see here that Jonah starts out the first chapter, the first 3 verses set the scene for the story. If we're going to understand the rest of the story of Jonah, we need to pay attention to these first 3 verses, because in those verses there's a very clear direction from God. There's a clear command of God. There is a go and preach to Nineveh. And then there's a response from Jonah. The Lord says go, and Jonah runs in the other direction. So one of the lessons that we have to glean from Jonah is obedience/disobedience. Obedience is a theme that is going to run, especially in this opening part of Jonah, especially as the story unfolds. We have to think about obedience. And this is a lesson sometimes because we think of Jonah as a preacher. Because after all, God calls and commands and instructs Jonah to go preach to Nineveh. So there's a very specific command of God for a very specific activity: go preach. Because of that, and I hope you're not in this category, sometimes we think that God gives commands to preachers, and so we can just sort of push Jonah to the side. Let me just assure you up front, this is not a message for preachers alone. It is a message for preachers, and I'm listening, but it's a message for everyone. Because obedience is not just about a preacher, a teacher, a pastor, a prophet, an evangelist. It's not. Obedience is not just for those special kind of people. Sometimes we think that. Obedience hits home for every one of us. God has given to us in His Word direction and command. What Jonah did was exaggerate a response for us in the story. God said, go this direction, and where did he go? He went the other direction. God said, go to Nineveh. What did Jonah do? It says, however, Jonah got up to flee from Tarshish. And I want to draw your attention to one other detail about this. When Jonah decided to run from God, do we run from God? Have you ever attempted to hide from God's presence? Have you ever attempted to get away from what you felt God was telling you to do? Have you ever turned a different way? Have you ever attempted to resist, to ignore God? I love what Jonah does because it helps us understand something. Jonah decided to flee from God's presence. Ridiculous. We're going to talk about that. How fast can you run, Jonah? I mean, really. How fast is the boat? He decided to run from God's presence, but I want you to, if you have a Bible, you can highlight, and your translation may read a little bit different, but I have underlined in mine, he paid the fare. He bought a ticket. He paid the price to get on a boat. He decided, I don't know if he thought God was afraid of water. I mean, I'm not sure. We don't think clearly when we're running from God. Write it down. We don't make sense when we think we can run from God's presence. But I don't know if he thought there was a boundary at the edge of the water that God can't go over here, so I'll get on a boat. But underline the phrase, he paid the fare, because when we run from God, there's always a price to be paid. When we decide that we're going to flee God's presence, when we're going to hide from God, when we're going to ignore God, when we're going to disobey, let me move forward in that because it rolls around to what we're talking about here is disobedience. When we decide that we're going to disobey God, there is a price that we pay. There is a price. Now, there are different ways to do that, but Jonah in the story helps us to understand he was willing to pay a price to run from God. And that's what he did. There's a strategy involved here that Jonah, he developed a strategy. Here's how I'm going to run from God. And it cost him something. It cost him something. Now, when you walk through what takes place here, we're going to see some things that take place where God gets his attention. But before we do that, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like for you to go with me so we can talk a little bit about running from God's presence. Would you turn in your Bibles to Psalm 139 with me? Now, if Jonah could have taken a book with him to the belly of the fish, I would have recommended Psalm 139. Psalm 139. I'm going to actually read, it's not that long, it's 24 verses, but I'm going to read the entire psalm. And I pray that the Lord will speak to your heart as I read this. Maybe you're in a place in your life where you're ignoring God, or you're running from God, or you're fleeing from His presence. Let me remind you, Psalm 139. It says this, Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and you know when I stand up. You understand my thoughts from far away. You observe my travels and my rest. You are aware of all of my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know all about it, Lord. You have encircled me. You have placed your hand on me. This extraordinary knowledge is beyond me. It's lofty. I'm unable to reach it. Here's the question. Where can I go to escape your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I live at the eastern horizon or settle at the western limits, even there your hand will lead me. Your right hand will hold on to me. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light around me will be like night. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night shines like the day. Darkness and light are alike to you, God. For it was you who created my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will praise you because I've been remarkably and wonderfully made. Your works are beautiful. And I know this very well. My bones were not hidden from you when I was made in secret, when I was formed in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw me when I was formless, and all my days were written in your book and planned before a single one of them began. God, how difficult your thoughts are for me to comprehend. God, how difficult your thoughts are for me to comprehend. How vast their sum is. If I counted them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I wake up, I am still with you. Verse 19. God, if only you would kill the wicked. You bloodthirsty men, stay away from me, who invoke you deceitfully. Your enemies swear by you falsely. Lord, don't I hate those who hate you and detest those who rebel against you? I hate them with extreme hatred. I consider them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart, and test me and know my concerns. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. It's a great song. It's a great song. And it's a song that helps us frame what is taking place in Jonah. Now, in the first chapter of Jonah, we are not told anything in those opening verses about why Jonah fled. Understand this. I'm not going to read anything into chapter 1. We'll get to some attitude. Trust me, next Sunday we'll get to attitude. Jonah, he has attitude, and it's not pretty. And what makes it so ugly is we see ourselves in Jonah fairly quickly, if we're honest. We're not told anything in chapter 1 why Jonah ran, but this psalm says, oh, God, if you would just destroy the wicked. I hate them that hate you. God, if you would just destroy them, if you would just wipe them off the face of the earth. Let's just think about this a minute in the context of Jonah. God was asking Jonah to go preach to the enemies of God's people and the enemies of God. And Nineveh was a great city. It was a big city. It was a powerful place. And it represented the enemies of God's people. It represented what the psalmist is talking about in Psalm 139. It represented the enemies. It represented those that hated God's people, and those that hated God, those were the Ninevites. And God was telling Jonah, go preach to them. Their wickedness has risen up to me. Their wickedness has confronted me. Go preach, Jonah. Go preach to Jonah. I'm calling you. I'm telling you, go preach to Nineveh. And Jonah reaches a place. I repeated a verse in Psalm 139 because it's an essential verse. When we run from God, there are all kinds of things that churn up in us. One, we don't like what God's telling us to do. Number two, we don't understand why God is doing what he's doing. And in that, your ways, God, are beyond my understanding. They are high. They are lofty. Isaiah says the same thing. We can't understand. The ways of God are above our ways. His ways are above our understanding. And so there is a wrestling that goes on here. In the midst of awe and worship and devotion in this psalm, there's also there's a time in the midst of it to get real and to say, God, there are times you tell me to do things and I don't understand it. I don't like it. I don't want to do it. God, I don't get it. And so our tendency is to ignore the presence of God, to attempt to run from the presence, and that's exactly what Jonah did. God said, go preach to Nineveh, and there is an immediate response. I'm going to flee from the presence of God because I don't want to do what he's telling me to do. I don't understand, why would God want me to go preach to Nineveh? I hate those people, God. I hate them. And you hate them, God. And I don't understand what you're doing. But the psalmist gets to the heart of the matter, and he says, God, he starts out by saying, you know me. You are with me. I can go to heaven, and you are there. I can make my bed in hell, and you are there. I can go to the east. I can go to the west. There is no way to escape you. When I wake up in the morning, your spirit is with me. I can't get away from you, and neither could Jonah, and neither can we. We can disobey. We can run. But as the old saying is, you can run, but you can't hide from God because he's there. Now, let's go back to Jonah for a moment. Let's go back. Psalm 139 helps us. What does God do when Jonah runs away? God, there are two powerful acts of God that unfold when Jonah runs. The first one is that when he gets on the boat, God sends a storm. And I've always marveled at the fact that, and the reason I'm doing this is the Hebrew word there means God threw a storm. He hurled it at Jonah and the boat. I've got this mental picture that God just says, throwing a storm. It is a storm with a purpose. It is a storm for a reason. It is a storm that God winds up and throws right down the middle. It's a strike. And he throws it at Jonah for a purpose. That purpose, in broad terms, is to get Jonah's attention. Do you think it worked? At first, it got the attention of the sailors a little bit more than it did Jonah. But eventually it gets Jonah's attention. As he was being thrown overboard, I guarantee you it had his attention. God threw a storm. The other thing is, after Jonah is thrown overboard, God prepared a fish to swallow Jonah. God prepared a fish to swallow Jonah. I'm just going to throw this out. Could it be that God works in our lives at times to get our attention? I'm just going to throw that out there. Maybe you're here today. Could it be that God is trying to get your attention? Now, God can throw a storm. God can prepare a fish. God can work through all manners. This is a very graphic and extreme story to illustrate how God gets our attention. But God works in all kinds of ways. God has used things other than storms and fish in my life to get my attention. We don't have time for me to go through all the times because I've been hard-headed, and there's been times that God has used many things. But I suspect I'm not the only one. I suspect that if you will be sensitive, that God uses things to get your attention. He prepared a fish for Jonah. Now, here's the interesting thing as we move forward here. Is when you look at this, verse 1 of chapter 2 says that Jonah prayed in the belly of the fish. Jonah's thrown overboard because of the storm. They've gotten rid of cargo. They've lightened the load. They've done these things so that they could save their lives. And when they do that, they get to the point to where they're very hesitant to do it, but they say, we're going to throw Jonah overboard. They throw Jonah overboard, and God prepared a fish to swallow Jonah. Now, I walk down here because traditionally we refer to this area of the church as the altar. And today we had a time of prayer, and the invitation was to come so that we can pray together. Our prayer elders took time to pray for folks in need, and we refer to this as the altar. I just wanted to illustrate for a moment that this is a very comfortable and convenient place to pray. In a few moments, I'll ask you to join me in prayer, and you can pray in your seat. You have nice, padded, cushioned pews. I didn't grow up with pews like that. When I was a kid and slept on the pews, it wasn't comfortable. And I did sleep a lot. Sunday night, boy, it was just like God gave me rest when I got to church. But it wasn't comfortable. We have nice, air-conditioned, heated sanctuary with great place to pray. I'm saying that for a reason. Compare that for a moment in your minds to the belly of a fish in terms of an altar. Chapter 2, verse 1 says that Jonah prayed in the belly of a fish. God may have prepared an air-conditioned, heated fish belly. I don't know. I can't tell you. It's not described. But I don't think it was comfortable. And sometimes in life, the places of prayer, after God gets our attention, sometimes those places are pretty uncomfortable. Can I get an amen? Because God has thrown a storm. God has prepared a fish. And when you get down in the end of, and I would encourage you to read Jonah's prayer. I would encourage you to read chapter 2 carefully and slowly and in its entirety. Because there's a beauty, there's a wonder that I find in Jonah's prayer there. And it talks about thanksgiving that he offers up. Just a side note, when I was in Arizona, one time I had the opportunity. It's the only time I've ever spoken in a Catholic church. And it was a community service. And I was invited to speak at the Catholic church, and it was Thanksgiving service. It was a Thanksgiving service, and I chose to speak out of Jonah chapter 2. And I'll never forget the look on the priest, who was probably not all that comfortable having me speak in the Catholic church. Wonderful man. But I'm not sure how comfortable he was with this young Church of God preacher speaking in the Catholic church. And I'll never forget the look on his face, and he said, what passage will you use in your message? I said, Jonah chapter 2. And that was the face he made. I don't think he said anything other than that. But I thought it was a good Thanksgiving message. And if God thought it was good, I'm good. But anyway, read it carefully. Read it carefully. It's a beautiful prayer. But I want to get down to the end. Jonah, I want to look at verses 8 and 9 especially. Look at it. Those who cling to worthless idols forsake faithful love. That's deep. Pardon the pun, Dakota. But that's deep. In the belly of a fish, he says, those who cling to worthless idols forsake faithful love. I just want you to weigh out the choice here, because Jonah's a lot about choices. Jonah has a lot to say about choices. Idols, and in Jonah's day, there were a lot of idols. That was something that God's people wrestled with. You may recall that the king, Jeroboam II, we referred to a few weeks ago, he's the one that set up golden calves in sacred places. And so Israel was experiencing idolatry in a large measure. Nineveh, we don't have to even get into detail about the idolatry that took place in Nineveh and the cities and the nations surrounding Israel. But they knew a lot about idols. Let me tell you something, that those are the obvious idols. There are also subtle idols, and idols have to do with anything we put ahead of God. Idols have to do with a worship, with an attention, with a priority, anything in our lives that we decide that we're going to elevate above God.